Have you ever paused, just for a moment in the middle of a hectic workday, the endless emails, the back-to-back meetings, the noise of deadlines pounding in your head, and asked yourself, is this it? Is this all life is meant to be? Maybe you've dreamed of escaping it all, moving to a quiet mountain temple, living off-grid by a river, or spending your days in silence, wrapped in the scent of burning incense and ancient wisdom. We've all entertained that fantasy, the notion that somewhere far away from our messy, stressful jobs lies a better, more meaningful life, a spiritual life. But what if? What if the path to awakening isn't in some faraway forest or retreat? What if it's right here, right where you are, in the inbox, in the crowded office, in the tiny moments between deadlines, in the heart of your daily labor? You see, one of the most overlooked teachings in the Buddhist path is this: awakening doesn't require you to abandon your life. It asks you to wake up inside it. For centuries, people have assumed that spiritual growth means withdrawing from the world. The wandering monk, the hermit in the hills, the sage in the cave. But the Buddha's wisdom was never meant for just monks and mystics. It was meant for people like you and me. People with jobs, with families, with difficult bosses and impossible schedules. Because real awakening isn't about where you are. It's about how you meet this moment. In ancient texts, the Buddha spoke of householders, people who lived and worked within society, and taught them not to abandon their duties, but to meet them with mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. The world itself, he said, can be your monastery. Every conversation a Dharma talk, every setback a lesson in impermanence, every act of kindness a sacred offering. Imagine that. Imagine your job, not as a tedious means to a paycheck, but as a living, breathing dojo for the mind and heart. A place where every challenge, every frustration, every small triumph can polish the mirror of your awareness. There's a story I love, perhaps you've heard it before. A young man approached a Zen master and asked, "Master, I wish to find enlightenment. Should I leave my work and retreat to the monastery?" The master looked at him for a long moment and said, "Show me your hands." The man held them out, rough and calloused from labor. The master smiled. "These are the hands of awakening. Go back to your work and in every moment be fully present. Enlightenment is not found in leaving life, but in fully entering it." That is the heart of what we'll be exploring here. How the work you do, whether you're a teacher, a driver, a nurse, a coder, a CEO, or a barista, can become part of your spiritual path. Not something separate from it. Not something you have to escape to find peace. But the very ground upon which your awakening can bloom. And it starts by seeing work differently. You see, much of our suffering at work doesn't come from the work itself, but from how we relate to it. It comes from the constant striving, the chasing of outcomes, the subtle belief that when I finish this, then I'll be happy. That endless horizon of when, always out of reach. The Buddha called this tanha, craving, a restless, thirsty clinging to what isn't here yet. And it's everywhere in the modern workplace. We chase promotions, praise, bigger paychecks, the next title on the door. And when it comes, it's never quite enough. The joy is fleeting, and soon we're restless again, chasing the next fix. But here's the thing. You could work for 30 years like this and never touch true satisfaction. Or you could shift your relationship with work today and discover peace right where you are. Because what you do is not nearly as important as how you do it. Whether you code an app or sweep a floor, every task holds the potential to wake you up if you meet it with presence. This is where mindfulness comes in. Not as a trendy productivity hack, but as a radical act of reclaiming your own life. Imagine starting your workday, not by checking your inbox, but by pausing. 3 deep breaths, feeling your feet on the ground. Noticing the weight of your body in your chair, the hum of the air conditioner, the rise and fall of your breath. This is it. This is your life. And as you move through your tasks, each one becomes a bell of mindfulness. The ringing phone, the taste of your coffee, the tension rising in your shoulders. Each a chance to notice, am I here, or am I lost in thought? In this way, work stops being a relentless race and becomes a practice, a mirror for your mind, a training ground for compassion, an opportunity to turn toward rather than away from what's difficult. And slowly, something changes. You find yourself less reactive. You meet setbacks with curiosity rather than panic. You start seeing the humanity in your coworkers, even the ones who frustrate you. And without even trying to be spiritual, you begin living the Dharma. Because true spirituality was never meant to be separate from life. It was always meant to infuse it, to dissolve the artificial line between sacred and ordinary. The Buddha once said, "As in the great ocean, there is but one taste, the taste of salt, so in this Dharma and discipline, there is but one taste, the taste of liberation." And that taste can be found anywhere, even here, even now, in the middle of a Tuesday morning meeting. Over the course of these chapters, we're going to explore how ancient wisdom meets the modern workplace, how ideas like karma yoga, right livelihood, compassion, and mindfulness aren't dusty relics from old monasteries, but alive, practical tools for your everyday life. How stress, conflict, and deadlines can stop being obstacles and start becoming your teachers. And it begins by seeing the work you do, no matter how mundane, as worthy of your full attention, as a vehicle for awakening. So the next time you find yourself dreading another Zoom call or grinding your teeth in traffic on your way to work, remember, this is it, this moment, this breath, this is your practice. Because the truth is, you don't need to change your job to find peace. You need to change how you meet your job. And the path to awakening, to freedom, to an unshakable sense of calm, it doesn't begin in the Himalayas. It begins exactly where you are, right now. You see, the moment we begin to view our work not just as a way to earn a living, but as an extension of our spiritual path, something profound happens. Ordinary actions start to feel sacred. Simple tasks reveal hidden wisdom, and the workplace itself, once a stage for stress and ambition, quietly transforms into a place of awakening. This isn't a new idea. In fact, it's one of the oldest. In the Bhagavad Gita, a beloved text in the yogic tradition, there's a powerful teaching known as karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action. And though it emerged from ancient India, its wisdom resonates perfectly with the Buddha's teachings and the realities of the modern workday. Karma yoga invites us to act fully, wholeheartedly, but without clinging to the outcome. To pour ourselves into our work, not for praise or promotion or some distant reward, but simply because it's what's in front of us. Because it's the next breath, the next step, a way to serve life itself. The Gita tells us, you have the right to your labor, but not to the fruits of your labor. Think about that for a moment. How much of our suffering at work comes from craving certain results, from the restless chase for recognition, status, control. But when you act simply because it's right, because it's kind, because it's mindful, then you become free. And this isn't about passivity. It's not about working without care or abandoning ambition. It's about anchoring yourself in intention, in integrity, in presence, while releasing your grip on what you can't control. And here's where Buddhist wisdom weaves seamlessly into this vision. Because one of the central teachings of the Buddha, the Noble Eightfold Path, offers us a map for this kind of awakened work. It's often misunderstood as a set of moral rules. But it's much more than that. It's a guide to skillful living, and every one of its 8 limbs can be practiced in the middle of your workday. Let's walk through them together. Right view. It starts with seeing things clearly, recognizing that everything is impermanent, that pleasure and pain, success and failure rise and fall like waves. In the workplace, this means not getting lost in temporary victories or defeats, understanding that every project, every deadline, every conflict is fleeting, and what remains always is the state of your own mind. Right intention. Why are you doing what you do? Is it for greed, ego, fear? Or is it for kindness, for growth, for service? When you set your intention each morning, not just to finish tasks, but to act with wisdom and compassion, everything you touch becomes a part of your path. Right speech. This is a big one in any workplace. How often do words become weapons? Gossip, harsh criticism, passive-aggressive remarks. But speech can also be medicine. A kind word to a stressed colleague. A calm, honest conversation instead of a heated argument. Every word you speak either binds you deeper into stress or sets you free. Right action. It's not about grand, heroic gestures. It's about the small, often invisible choices. Choosing integrity when no one's watching. Refusing to cut corners even when it's easier. Acting in ways that leave no harm and ideally, a little more kindness in their wake. Right livelihood. Not everyone can abandon their job for something overtly spiritual. But the Buddha encouraged us to avoid work that causes harm to ourselves, to others, or to the planet. And if your work isn't perfectly pure, you can still infuse it with good intentions. A banker can practice generosity. A lawyer can practice fairness. A corporate leader can practice compassion. Right effort. This is about balance. Not burning yourself out chasing impossible perfection. Not giving up and numbing out. But steady, patient effort toward what's wholesome. It's the daily choice to redirect your energy toward mindfulness, kindness, honesty, even when no one else is. Right mindfulness, the practice of being here, fully present in each task, not multitasking your way through life, not getting lost in endless mental commentary, but tasting your tea when you drink it, feeling your breath when tension rises, noticing how your emotions shift during that difficult meeting. Your workplace is filled with hundreds of these tiny gateways back to awareness, right concentration, and finally, the ability to gather your scattered attention. To train the mind not to be yanked around by every notification or distraction, but to settle, to focus deeply, even for a few moments. In those moments, the mundane becomes extraordinary, and you begin to realize it was never the work itself that was dull, it was the restless mind trying to escape it. Together, these 8 elements form a kind of spiritual technology, a way to live skillfully, awake to each moment, grounded in what matters. And when Karma Yoga's wisdom of acting without attachment to outcome meets the Noble Eightfold Path's clarity and compassion, work becomes something else entirely. It becomes a practice, a mirror, a teacher. You discover that every task, every interaction, every struggle is shaping you, not as punishment, not as a test, but as an invitation to meet each moment, not with resistance but with curiosity, not with craving but with presence, to ask again and again, what's the most mindful, kind, and honest way to meet this moment? And you start noticing subtle shifts. The email that once made your stomach clench is now a bell of mindfulness. The irritating coworker becomes a lesson in compassion. The tedious assignment becomes a meditation in attention. Work no longer steals your time. It becomes your path. And in that, you touch something timeless, a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, a joy that isn't about winning or losing, a kind of quiet liberation in the middle of ordinary life. And isn't that what we've been seeking all along? Not escape, but awakening right here in the middle of it all. And once you glimpse this, something beautiful happens. You realize that even your most difficult days hold the potential for insight. That your workplace, with all its flaws, is a living monastery. That you don't have to wait for some perfect future to begin your practice. You're already in it. The question is, will you wake up to it? It's a quiet truth most of us overlook. We spend the vast majority of our lives doing ordinary things, answering emails, washing dishes, waiting in line, attending meetings, moments so mundane they almost seem invisible. And yet, if you pay close attention, these ordinary moments are where your life actually happens. Not in grand vacations, not in once-in-a-lifetime breakthroughs, but here, in this breath, in this task, in this exact instant you're in. The Buddha often spoke about this. That enlightenment isn't found in escaping the world, but in awakening fully to it. And the simplest way to begin is through mindfulness. Mindfulness isn't some abstract concept reserved for monasteries or silent retreats. It's the practice of being wholly present in whatever you're doing. Whether you're leading a meeting or sweeping the floor, mindfulness invites you to fully inhabit the moment, to experience it as it is, without resistance, distraction, or judgment. And when you begin to approach work in this way, something subtle, yet profound, starts to shift. Let's start with the basics. When you wake up in the morning before reaching for your phone, before the mind fills with to-do lists and deadlines, pause. Feel your breath. Notice the light in the room. Acknowledge, even for a moment, that you are alive, and that this ordinary day holds infinite potential for awakening. As you move through your morning routine, treat each action as a practice. Feel the sensation of warm water on your hands. Notice the sound of footsteps on the floor. Taste your first sip of tea or coffee. Let these small moments be your first meditation of the day. And then, as you step into your work, bring that same gentle awareness with you. When you sit at your desk, take one conscious breath before you open your laptop. Feel the coolness of the keyboard under your fingertips. Notice how your body is seated. Are your shoulders tense? Is your jaw tight? Simply notice without judgment and soften where you can. Now, here's where mindfulness transforms from theory to living practice. Every task, no matter how trivial, becomes an opportunity. When writing an email, be fully present with the words you choose. Not rushing to get it done, not half thinking about what's next. Just this email, just this sentence. Notice the way your thoughts form, the subtle impulse to impress, defend, or hurry. Meet those impulses with curiosity and gently return to what you're doing. When attending a meeting, listen with your whole being, not just waiting for your turn to speak or silently crafting a rebuttal, but truly hearing what others say. Observe the rise and fall of emotions, boredom, irritation, excitement, and recognize them as passing clouds. Even during moments of frustration or stress, mindfulness offers a refuge. When a project hits a setback or a colleague says something unkind, notice the immediate reaction in your body, the tightening in your chest, the heat in your face. Instead of reacting blindly, pause, take a breath. Name the feeling. This is frustration. This is anxiety. By acknowledging it, you loosen its grip, and slowly you realize something remarkable. You are not your stress. You are not your fleeting emotions. You are the awareness that notices them. This practice isn't about becoming passive or indifferent. It's about responding with clarity instead of reacting from habit. Imagine this. Instead of rushing through your tasks like a checklist to be conquered, you approach each one as a meditation. Filing a report, returning a phone call, organizing your workspace. Each task, no matter how small, becomes sacred. Because what matters isn't the size of the action, it's the quality of attention you bring to it. The Zen masters call this the practice of one thing. When drinking tea, just drink tea. When walking, just walk. When working, just work. Simple, but not easy. Our modern world thrives on distraction. A relentless stream of notifications, multitasking, and mental chatter. But every time you return your awareness to the task at hand, no matter how many times you've strayed, you're strengthening a profound inner muscle. Over time, you'll notice the effects. A deeper sense of calm even on busy days. A quiet joy in simple things. A natural patience with challenges. And more than that, you'll begin to experience yourself differently. Not as a bundle of stress and stories, but as the spacious awareness behind it all. Even cleaning your desk can be a spiritual practice if you're fully there for it. Even sorting files can be a meditation if you bring your whole self to the act. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require you to change your job, your schedule, or your environment. It simply asks you to show up fully for what's already here. Mindfulness turns every moment into a mirror, every task into a teacher, and your entire workday into a monastery. And yes, you'll forget. 1,000 times a day, your mind will wander. You'll catch yourself lost in thought, in judgment, in distraction. That's not failure. That's the practice. Each time you notice you've drifted is a sacred moment, a moment of awakening. You return to this breath, to this task, to this life unfolding exactly as it is. And gradually, the line between spiritual practice and daily life begins to dissolve. You realize there was never a separation, only the illusion of one. Every moment counts, every task matters. And when you meet them with mindful presence, even the most ordinary moments shimmer with quiet grace. The path to awakening isn't somewhere else. It's here, in your hands, in your breath, in this very task before you. And as we continue this journey together, let's explore how even the pressures and chaos of the modern workplace, the deadlines, the conflicts, the relentless pace, can become not obstacles, but powerful tools for awakening. Because often, it's in the places we least expect that the deepest wisdom is waiting. In every workplace, there are people, not just emails, not just deadlines, but human beings, each one carrying silent burdens, private hopes, unseen battles. And it's so easy to forget this, isn't it? We get caught in our tasks, our frustrations, our ambitions, and suddenly the people around us become obstacles. That colleague who always disagrees, the manager who never seems satisfied, the team member who makes the same mistake again and again. But if we pause, truly pause, and remember that each person before us is just like us, longing to be happy, struggling with fears, trying to make sense of a complicated world, something beautiful happens. Compassion awakens, and this is where real spiritual practice begins. You see, it's easy to be mindful when you're alone, when the room is quiet, when no one's pressing your buttons. But the true test of mindfulness, and perhaps its greatest reward, is found in the way we relate to others. Buddhism calls this metta, loving kindness. Not a soft, sentimental emotion, but a fierce, courageous kindness. A willingness to see the humanity in others, even when it's inconvenient, even when they don't deserve it by our usual standards. And it begins, like all things, with awareness. The next time a coworker frustrates you, notice what happens inside, that tightening in the chest, the story your mind starts telling. They're always like this. Why can't they be better? Instead of feeding the narrative, pause, take a breath. And then, if only for a moment, consider, what might this person be carrying that I cannot see? Maybe they didn't sleep last night. Maybe they're caring for a sick parent. Maybe they feel invisible. Maybe they, too, are longing to be appreciated. This simple act of imagining another's hidden suffering is a sacred practice. It softens the heart. It dissolves the armor we wear at work. And it reminds us that, beneath our roles and titles, we're all in this together. But compassion isn't just about empathy. It's also about wisdom. Interpersonal wisdom means recognizing that every interaction is an opportunity, a chance to learn, a chance to practice patience, a chance to witness your own ego in action. Have you noticed how certain people trigger you more than others? How one colleague's tone of voice or choice of words can spark a reaction in you faster than anything else? That reaction isn't about them. It's a mirror, a reflection of something within you. Maybe it stirs your insecurity. Maybe it threatens your sense of control. Maybe it challenges an identity you cling to. And if you have the courage to look, you'll see that those difficult people are your most powerful teachers. The Buddha once said, "An enemy can be your greatest teacher, for they show you what you have yet to master." What if you approached every conflict not as something to win or avoid, but as a spiritual lesson tailor-made for your awakening? When someone criticizes you, instead of reacting defensively, notice the sting. Feel where it lands in the body. Watch the thoughts it triggers. And ask yourself, is there truth here? Or is this touching an old wound I have yet to heal? When a teammate disappoints you, rather than silently resenting them, consider what expectation you had placed upon them. Was it fair? Was it necessary? Was it born from compassion or control? Slowly, you'll realize that every difficult interaction is really a conversation with yourself. And when you learn to meet others with understanding, without abandoning your own clarity or boundaries, you begin to embody true interpersonal wisdom. You stop needing to be right. You stop needing to be liked. You stop needing the world to conform to your preferences. Instead, you show up as you are, with kindness, with clarity, with presence. And you begin to see people not as characters in your personal drama, but as fellow travelers on this bewildering, beautiful journey of being human. One of the great practices from Buddhist tradition is the metta bhavana, the meditation on loving kindness. Even if you don't formally sit in meditation at work, you can silently practice it throughout your day. As you pass a colleague in the hallway, silently wish them well. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be free from suffering. When you receive a difficult email, pause, take a breath, and before you respond, silently think, this person too wants to be at peace. These invisible acts of compassion soften the sharp edges of our workplace relationships. They cultivate a steady, quiet kindness that isn't dependent on others' behavior. And remarkably, over time, they change you. You become less reactive, less defensive, more attuned to the subtle joys of connection. You begin to experience work not as a battlefield, but as a sacred classroom, where every encounter, every frustration, every triumph is another lesson in how to love. This doesn't mean you become passive or endlessly accommodating. Compassion without wisdom is sentimentality. Wisdom without compassion is cold. The balance is found when you can hold your ground while keeping your heart open, when you can disagree without hatred, when you can set boundaries without bitterness. This is the path of the bodhisattva in the modern world, not escaping to mountaintops, but showing up fully in the boardrooms, classrooms, and factory floors of life. And as you practice this, you might notice something miraculous. The people around you begin to soften too, not because you've changed them, but because your presence, your steadiness, your kindness creates a space where others feel safe to be human. And that is a kind of leadership no job title can bestow. So as you move through your workday, remember, every conversation matters. Every silent wish of kindness matters. Every time you choose understanding over judgment, you're shaping the unseen fabric of the world. And in this way, the workplace becomes not just a place to earn a living, but a living meditation on what it means to be fully, fiercely, beautifully human. Life doesn't ask for our permission before handing us difficulty. It arrives unannounced. A sudden disagreement with a client, a project that falls apart at the last minute, a promotion that goes to someone else, or a quiet, gnawing anxiety that follows you home after hours. And in those moments, our instinct is to resist, to blame, to fight, or to numb ourselves with distraction. But what if every challenge you face at work wasn't an interruption to your practice, but the very heart of it? What if each difficulty wasn't a problem to escape, but a Dharma lesson in disguise? The great Buddhist teacher Shantideva once said, "Where would there be an opportunity to practice patience if there were no harm doers in this world?" The same is true for the workplace. Without frustrations, how would you cultivate calm? Without unfairness, how would you learn equanimity? Without setbacks, how would you discover resilience? This is the radical insight of transforming work into a spiritual path. The situations you wish would go away are often the ones that can wake you up. When things go smoothly, the mind drifts into habit. You work, you succeed, you get praised, and you fall into the trance of accomplishment. But when things fall apart, you're forced to pay attention. Suddenly, you're no longer on autopilot. You feel your heartbeat quicken, your jaw clench, your thoughts race. And right there in that raw, unfiltered moment is a perfect opportunity to practice. Not by suppressing your emotions, not by pretending you're above it all, but by meeting your experience exactly as it is. When frustration arises, notice it. Where does it land in the body? What story does your mind start spinning? Is it blaming others? Is it shaming yourself? Is it catastrophizing the future? See it clearly. Name it without judgment. This is frustration. This is anger. This is fear. And then the most important step, stay. Stay with the discomfort. Not as a victim, not as a martyr, but as a curious, compassionate witness. Ask yourself, what is this moment teaching me? Is it showing you your attachment to control, your craving for recognition, your aversion to uncertainty. The Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, isn't some abstract philosophy to be kept on a meditation cushion. It's alive in the heat of your daily life. Every conflict is a teacher, every disappointment a sutra, every unmet expectation a koan to unravel. Take stress, for example. Most of us treat stress like an enemy, something to get rid of. But what if stress is just a signal, a flashing light on the dashboard of your consciousness saying, "Look here, pay attention"? Maybe it's pointing to unrealistic expectations you're placing on yourself. Maybe it's highlighting your tendency to please others at the expense of your own well-being. Maybe it's revealing a deeper fear of inadequacy that no promotion or paycheck can silence. When you approach stress with curiosity instead of resistance, it transforms. It stops being the monster chasing you and becomes the messenger you've been avoiding. The same applies to failure. We've been conditioned to see failure as the opposite of success. But in Dharma, failure is neither good nor bad, it's simply information. It shows you where your strategies didn't align with reality. It reveals the places where your ego still clings. It offers you humility if you're brave enough to receive it. Zen masters often say, "Fall down 7 times, get up 8." But more importantly, each time you fall, pay attention to what tripped you. And here's a profound truth. The bigger the challenge, the greater the potential awakening it carries. The betrayal you never saw coming. The job loss that cracked your identity open. The public mistake that left you exposed. These are sacred thresholds. If you dare to meet them fully, without collapsing or numbing out, you'll discover dimensions of strength and insight you didn't know you possessed. This is the essence of the Bodhisattva path. To willingly stay in the world amidst its messiness and use every difficulty as fuel for awakening. You don't have to escape to a monastery. The office can be your temple. Your toughest coworker can be your spiritual mentor. Your failures can be your scriptures. It's a fierce, luminous kind of practice. One that doesn't deny the sharp edges of life, but uses them to hone the blade of your awareness. And the more you embrace this, the less fearful you become. Challenges still hurt, they still shake you, but they no longer define you. You start to trust that whatever arises, you have the tools to meet it, not perfectly, not without emotion, but with presence, with dignity, with a kind of unshakable curiosity. And slowly, work stops being something that happens to you and becomes a canvas where the art of your spiritual life is painted in real time. So the next time the deadline looms, the client complains, or the unexpected crisis hits, pause, take a breath, and silently ask, what Dharma lesson is hidden here? Then listen, not with your anxious mind, but with your heart, with your body, with the deepest part of you that knows every moment, no matter how difficult, carries within it the seeds of awakening. And when you live this way, work is no longer just work. The truth is, mindfulness isn't something reserved for meditation retreats, mountain hermitages, or quiet dawn sittings. It belongs here, in the messy, beautiful, unpredictable rhythm of your ordinary workday. It belongs in the flicker of your screen as you open your inbox, in the tension that rises before a difficult meeting, in the quiet moments between one task ending and another beginning. The ancient masters taught that awakening isn't found in grand experiences. It's cultivated through simple, consistent awareness of the present moment. And nowhere offers you more opportunities for that practice than your everyday routine. So how do you actually do it? How do you turn theory into daily embodiment? How do you weave mindfulness into the demands of meetings, deadlines, and endless to-do lists? It starts small, with ordinary practical techniques, humble on the surface, yet transformative in effect. Let's begin at the very start of your workday, before you check your phone, before you open your laptop, before the noise begins. Take one conscious breath, just one. Inhale slowly, feeling the cool air entering your nostrils, your chest expanding. Pause, then exhale gently, following the warmth of the breath as it leaves your body. In that single breath, you're no longer in yesterday's regrets or tomorrow's anxieties. You're here. This isn't a performance. You don't need to feel calm. The practice is simply remembering to return. Then, as you begin your tasks, try this ancient technique from Zen, single tasking. Yes, in a world that worships multitasking, you're going to choose one thing and give it your undivided attention. When you write an email, just write. When you read a report, just read. When you answer a call, just answer. Let your entire body and mind enter the activity. If you notice your mind wandering, as it inevitably will, gently guide it back, like a kind shepherd tending a restless flock. You'll be astonished how much clearer, faster, and more graceful your work becomes when your presence isn't split in 5 directions. Next, integrate micropauses. Between finishing one task and starting the next, resist the urge to immediately jump ahead. Instead, take a 3-breath pause. No special posture required. Simply stop, let your hands rest, close your eyes if you wish, and feel 3 full, conscious breaths. This tiny ritual acts like a reset button for your nervous system. It prevents stress from snowballing unnoticed, and it marks the invisible spaces in your day where stillness quietly waits. Now, consider reclaiming your lunch break. Even if you have only 10 minutes, turn it into a sanctuary. Put away your phone. Step outside if you can. Eat slowly, tasting your food. Notice the colors, textures, and flavors. This isn't about perfection, it's about remembering you have a body, that you are not a machine built for endless output. When stress builds, and it will, work skillfully with your body. The Buddha taught that awareness of the body is a powerful anchor to the present. When you feel tension, pause and scan yourself. Where is it gathering? Is your jaw tight, shoulders raised, stomach clenched? Inhale into that area, not to force relaxation, but to soften your relationship with the discomfort. Even a subtle shift in posture, a stretch, or standing to walk for a minute can interrupt the trance of stress and invite clarity back in. And don't underestimate the power of sound. When the office noise or relentless notifications overwhelm you, try this. Listen for the most distant sound you can detect. Maybe it's a faint bird outside, or the hum of an air conditioner, or the echo of footsteps down the hall. This simple act pulls you out of the mental fog and roots you in the direct experience of the moment. It's a classic mindfulness technique dressed in everyday clothing. Now, one of the most neglected yet potent practices, mindful transitions. Most of us carry residue from one interaction into the next. An irritating meeting bleeds into our next email. A frustrating phone call colors our conversation with a colleague. But what if you treated each transition as a fresh beginning? Before moving to the next task, take a conscious pause. Let the last moment go, like setting down a heavy bag you've been carrying. You might silently say to yourself, "New moment, new opportunity." These brief acts of inner housekeeping prevent small frustrations from accumulating into emotional exhaustion by day's end. And then, as your workday closes, resist the modern temptation to drag it endlessly into your evening. When you shut your computer, truly shut it. Close your eyes. Thank yourself for your effort, however messy or incomplete it felt. Take one final breath, marking the end of your workday with dignity and awareness. This small ritual signals to your nervous system, you are released. In this way, mindfulness ceases to be something extra you add to your schedule. It becomes the very fabric of your day, a thread of presence woven through the moments others overlook, a quiet rebellion against busyness, a sacred conversation with your own attention. And here's the beautiful secret. The more you practice these simple techniques, the more spacious your inner world becomes. Tasks that once drained you will feel lighter. Difficult conversations will unfold with surprising grace. Your mind will grow quieter. Not empty, but less reactive, more discerning. And one day, perhaps without even noticing when it happened, you'll realize that your workplace, this chaotic, demanding, beautiful place, has become your monastery. Your desk, an altar. Your breath, a mantra. Your actions, a prayer. Not because you've changed your environment, but because you've changed your way of being within it. This is the heart of skillful living. This is the art of transforming work into a path of awakening. And it's available to you, right now, in this very breath. Somewhere along the way, we were sold the idea that spiritual practice belongs in temples, monasteries, and quiet rooms with softly lit candles. That awakening happens far away, in distant lands or in rare, transcendent moments. But the old masters knew better. They understood something most of us overlook, that your ordinary, demanding, messy, glorious workday is one of the greatest arenas for awakening you'll ever encounter. Your office, your shop floor, your classroom, your studio, they're not obstacles to your path. They are the path. Think of it like this: every workplace is a Dharma dojo, a living, breathing training ground where every interaction, every challenge, every frustration and success is a teacher in disguise. Your difficult coworker, a lesson in patience. That tight deadline, a teaching on impermanence and non-attachment. The surprise praise from your boss, a chance to witness your ego rise and gently bow to it. The endless stream of emails, an invitation to practice presence. Work isn't a distraction from your spiritual life. It's the place where your practice is tested, refined, and made real. The Buddha never promised enlightenment in some perfect, serene environment. He pointed us back to where we already stand, right here, in the middle of your life. It's easy to feel present when sitting under a bodhi tree. The real art is staying awake when your inbox is overflowing and someone's asking for one more thing. But here's the beautiful paradox. The more you meet those ordinary moments with mindful attention, the less ordinary they become. You begin to see the sacred shimmering just beneath the surface of your tasks. You recognize the interdependence behind every interaction, how your labor serves others, how your words ripple outward, how your attention shapes your reality. You start to realize that work isn't something you endure to reach some distant weekend or retirement. It's a living, breathing opportunity to practice generosity, patience, compassion, discipline, wisdom. It's the place where theory becomes experience. The ancient teachings come alive not in abstract ideas, but in those precise moments you choose to pause before reacting, to breathe before speaking, to soften rather than harden. The tiny acts of awareness, repeated countless times, are what slowly shape your character. This is why the Zen masters said, every day is a good day. Not because every day is easy, but because every day and every workplace contains within it the raw materials for your awakening. You won't always get it right. Some days you'll forget. You'll lose yourself in irritation, in distraction, in craving. That's part of the training too. The point isn't perfection, it's returning, over and over again, to the breath, to the body, to the present moment, to the awareness that this is it, this is your dojo, this is your practice, this is your life. And perhaps, if you keep showing up, not as a worker chasing productivity, but as a practitioner cultivating wisdom, your ordinary work will begin to feel less like a burden and more like a sacred offering. Not because the job changes, but because you do. You'll stop waiting for conditions to be perfect. Stop fantasizing about peace somewhere else, and realize that awakening happens here, now, in the flicker of your screen, in the sound of your colleague's voice, in the click of your keyboard, in the ordinary, repetitive, precious acts of your day. And when that insight lands, even for a moment, you'll understand what the old teachers meant when they said, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Nothing outside changes, but your way of being within it transforms. And in that quiet revolution, your work becomes a spiritual path, a vehicle for compassion, a training ground for wisdom, a daily practice of returning to what's real. So as you rise tomorrow to step back into your role, whatever form it takes, remember this: you are not just a worker. You are a practitioner, a student of the way, and this very workday is your temple. The ancient teachings weren't meant to be locked away in dusty books or far-off monasteries. They were meant for you, right here, right now, in this breath, in this task, in this ordinary, extraordinary life.